Because of this, we can both see through the model and also select through the model, which makes sense in this mode since nothing is solid in this view, so we should be able to see through it and select through it. You can actually disable this though, and everything will be drawn as wires still, but the objects themselves are not see-through anymore. So let me toggle that back on and off. And as you can see, this can really help simplify your scene and help you visualize things better. But as the default setting for wireframe view, I would recommend keeping X-ray turned on and set to 0. Now let me tab out of edit mode, and I'll press / on the numpad to get back to global view here. And let's move on to something else now. Let's go back up into our viewport shading menu, and let's work with shadow here now. So let me enable that, and this is pretty self-explanatory. As you can see, when I turned it on, it added some shadows being cast onto the terrain. And we can adjust the strength of the shadow with this value here. And if we go into the cog menu right here, we have other options for light direction. Unlike the standard studio lighting, the lighting that's casting the shadows is actually fixed in place, and it won't follow us around when we change the view. So if you do want to change the direction of the shadows, go into the gear menu here, click on the ball there, and just change the direction of the lighting. Now the shadow shift option down here just seems to add some contrast to the shadowing, and the shadow focus here is the softness or sharpness of the shadow. If we turn that all the way up, only the sharpest shadows remain. So let me turn that off, and let's move on to cavity now. So let me enable cavity real quick, and also I'm going to grab that building, press / on the numpad to isolate it in local view again. Let me zoom in on the door here, and take a look at all the edges and all the angles as I turn this off and on. You can see there's definitely some changes being made. Cavity will add extra shading to your objects to help you visualize their angles better. So it's going to make concave angles darker, like this concave angle down there. So it's going to basically just add shadows to cracks and corners. And it'll also make convex angles lighter. So it's going to brighten pointier edges, like on the corner right here. You can see how that gets changed when I turn cavity on and off. Now there's a couple other options for the cavity feature. We have the type right here, and when it's set to world, it seems to have a softer effect. And when it's set to screen, it seems to have sharper lines for more finer details. And then of course, the both option here is going to be a combination of both of them. So let me set that back to world because I like the softer effect better. Now we have some extra options down here for the ridges and the valleys. We can brighten them or darken them. If we crank the ridge up, for example, it's going to brighten those sharper points. But we can also disable that by turning that all the way down to 0. Now we just have the shadowing. And whoops, where'd it go? Let's go back there. Let me put ridge back up to 1. Now the valleys here are for the crevices, the areas that get darkened. If we turn that all the way up to 1, you can see we can make that much darker, or we can turn that off by turning it down to 0. So this option provides you with a nice ambient occlusion type effect to help you visualize your model with some shadowing. And this actually works with separate objects as well. So if I press Shift and D to duplicate this and move it over, you can see the one object here, which is separate, is actually casting a shadow on the other object. So this ambient occlusion effect will cross between objects as well. And let me zoom in a little bit on the shadows. Now, one other option is in the gear icon right here. These are just options to help you fine-tune the shading, including samples, which you can crank up for a higher quality, or you can lower down for lower quality but faster calculations. So let me set that back to default. What was it, 16? I think so. Alright, so that does it for the cavity option. So let me disable that, and next we'll work with depth of field. But first let me press / on the numpad to go back to global view. And depth of field only works in camera view, so let me press numpad 0 to go into camera view. And the depth of field option will take whatever depth of field settings you have for your camera and it'll actually display that in solid shaded view. So let me enable the camera rig layer here so I can left click here and actually select the camera. Let's go over to the camera properties here, and you can see we already have depth of field enabled and we have some settings already set. So let me activate the depth of field option here, and if I zoom in you can see the foreground here became blurry where it wasn't before. And let me make that a little bit more obvious by turning f-stop down to 0.04. And there we go. So whatever settings you change here will be displayed in camera view in the 3D viewport in solid shaded view. Alright, moving on. Now the outline option down here will simply draw an outline of your object with a solid color. This can help objects stand out from one another. For example, let's say I added a cube right here, and let me scale it up. If that cube wasn't selected, you would easily see the outline going around it when I turn this option off and on. And that just helps you know where the boundaries of your objects are. And it's also useful because it draws an outline wherever two objects intersect. You can see that outline being drawn right there where the cube intersects the terrain. The important part of that is it also shows that outline still when you're in wireframe mode. So when you're working in wireframe mode, you can't always know if two objects are intersecting, but if you have outline turned on, it still leaves that outline drawn where they intersect. So that can definitely be useful. I've personally found the outline to be problematic sometimes in certain circumstances, so sometimes in certain situations you might want to turn that off. But it doesn't really matter too much. Now let's see what we're up to. We're down to specular lighting down there. Let me get a good view of the terrain here, and you can see the specular highlights shining off the surface. If you wanted to turn them off and get more of a flat kind of general illumination, then just turn specular lighting off, and everything's a little bit more flat. Alright, and that does it for solid shaded view and wireframe view and all of their options. Let me re-enable specular lighting there. And next up, we're going to be looking at Blender 2.8's new material preview mode, which is especially good for shader creation because this is a real-time mode that will let you see your results instantly. So solid shading had that texture option up here, which showed you the selected image texture node on your object, but that's as far as that goes. And this is obviously not a good final representation of your shader here. Material preview mode will actually show you a better representation of your final shader, meaning it'll display image textures, normal maps, procedural textures, and all of that. So you'll get a more accurate visual of your final shader. So let's enable that by pressing the Z key for the shading pie menu, and then enable material preview. Now, depending on how complex your scene and your shaders are, it might actually take a few seconds for everything to load in. And there we go. This is what the final shaders look like. Now, this isn't what the final render looks like because it's not taking into account your final lighting setup and everything like that. But this mode is especially useful when creating your shaders because you can instantly preview your shaders as you're building them or changing them up. For example, let me select the building right here. I'll split the view and I'll load in the shader editor again. And let's play around with the normal map values right here. Let's say we didn't know whether or not we wanted the normal map on the roof tiles here to be stronger or weaker. We can simply adjust the normal map value here, and we instantly see those changes in the 3D viewport. And that is just so awesome, and a huge and amazing step up from past versions of Blender, which actually required you to render the scene in the viewport in order to fully preview your shaders, which took up a lot of time. So you can imagine how much of a pain that could be versus just making a change here and instantly seeing those changes in the viewport. Now let me get rid of this. We'll join these back together. So this is a mode that we'll be using all the time, and depending on the complexity of your scene or shaders though, this mode could be a bit slower than solid shading, so we'll still be using solid shading a lot as well. Both modes have their advantages. Now, Material Preview has some shading options in the menu up here as well, so let's go through them now. So by default, Material Preview mode is lit up by these HDRI environments, and you can switch these for different looks if you want. And you can also rotate the background using the rotation value here. Now the background option down here shows the studio light or the lighting environment in the background, and it looks like a very blurred version of the background. And you can see that rotate around as we change the rotation value. Let me turn that back down to 0. Now if you already have your own world set up, then you can use those settings to light the environment by enabling the Scene World option right there. So now it's using the HDRI environment set up in the world to light the scene and to display in the background. And we can also light the scene with any light we added to the scene by enabling Scene Lights right here. And there we go. Now if you're curious about these effects, like the glow and the volumetric lighting, you can enable these over in the render properties right here. When the render engine is set to Eevee, which is Blender's real-time render engine, we have access to these real-time effects which also work in Material Preview, since that mode is actually driven by the Eevee engine. And we'll get into Eevee more later in the course, but as you can see, these effects right here will actually change the way Material Preview mode works as well. Now keep in mind you don't need to keep the render engine set to Eevee for these effects to work in Material Preview. This is just where you'll find those options. So you can change the options here for Material Preview, but then still set it to a different render engine in the end if you want. Now when you're in Material Preview and you have both Scene Lights and Scene World turned on, this is pretty much your final Eevee render. But you can see the scene is pretty dark, so it might be hard to build shaders like this. So you'll often want to keep the Scene Lights and Scene World turned off, so you can work with this in a more functional manner and actually be able to see your shaders. And then in order to see the final render, we can switch the shading modes by pressing the Z key for the pie menu, and we can switch that to rendered view. And now we can see our final Eevee render here. And no matter which render engine you have set, rendered mode shows you the final scene using the scene's actual lighting, world settings, and all final shaders. This mode is still just in the viewport, but it shows you the final render of the scene no matter what view you're in, which is really cool. To actually render out your final scene from the camera view, you can either go to the render menu up here and click render image, or you can press F12. And there we go. Now we're going to go over the different render engines later in the course, but just as a primer, there are two main render engines. There's Eevee, which we have it set to now, and you can see it here. And this is a real-time renderer, so it's fast. But it's not a ray tracer though, so the lighting results will not be physically accurate. Now we can also switch the renderer to Cycles, which is Blender's ray tracer. It gives us physically accurate lighting by mimicking how photons actually behave in real life when they bounce around the environment. As you can probably guess, this takes longer to calculate, so your render times will be longer, and that's why this render in the viewport is taking longer and is a lot noisier at first. Both render engines can produce amazing results, but we'll get into both of them later on in the course. Alright, so that's going to do it for all the different shading modes and all the different shading options. So that's going to do it for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one.